Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the recent agitation about postal voting from the right wing, but now creeping into the Conservative Party. But are they thinking this one through? So when it comes to winning, the Tories are always desperate, of course, to win by fair means or foul. 2 years ago, they legislated to create requirements for voter ID to be presented at polling stations in order to vote. The argument used was to tackle voter fraud. However, we have never had a voter fraud problem. There have been literally, famously, more MPs convicted of crimes this Parliament than people of voter fraud. Maybe we should be taking action to deal with the criminal legislators. But anyway, as part of the process, elderly voters have a list as long as your arm of acceptable forms of ID. In England, if you're young, you've got a few. If you're elderly, yeah, a travel pass will do you. If you've got a young travel pass, yeah, that's no good. An elderly person's Oyster card, yeah, that's fine. A young person, no. And millions of people are known to not have any of these forms of ID. Like, unlike in other countries where ID is required and everyone thinks it's perfectly normal, not only does everyone realise they need that ID, but there is a system for making sure people have that ID. Not in this country. You know, in theory, you say it's possible to access a dedicated voter ID from your council, but no effort was made by the government to tell people they needed it to vote. You know, when COVID came around, the government sent a letter about it to every household. When it came to legislating for voter ID, was a letter sent to every household saying, this is important, read this. Oh, you need voter ID now? No, we got none of that. So a lot of people don't even realise they need it, or if they do, they think that what they have is already fine when it's not. And if they don't have anything, they don't know how to get it. Unlike, as I say, some other countries where presenting ID at elections is commonplace, we don't have an automatic system of issuing ID in Britain. Finally, one of the cabinet ministers at the time of the legislation was passed, Jacob Rees-Mogg, famously admitted last year that it was passed in an effort to help out the Conservative Party by suppressing voters who were more likely to support other parties. So someone who was involved at high-level discussions of this legislation came out straight out and said, yeah, we used it to try and give ourselves an advantage. So any claims that, no, Phil, the legislation had good intentions, completely undermined by the public words of a senior member of the government which passed the law. So in order to limit the number of people having their votes taken in this way, lots of us try to warn people, of course. We try to do what the government should have done. We need to explain to people that they need the ID, what ID is acceptable and how to get it. We also need to tell them if they don't have the ID, they can use postal voting as an alternative, although be careful of that as well. Legislation has also been passed to take people off the postal voting register after a certain period of time. I don't think that should affect anyone before this next general election, but it will in the future. If this legislation isn't removed, just check. I'm not sure if people get an automatic notification when this happens. I suspect not. So when the election is called, just check you're still on that register. But I've now started to see a small number of Tories targeting postal voting. Now, I've seen various right-wing commentators attacking postal voting for some time. But, you know, the odd member of the Conservative Party is odd. Most notably, Brendan Clark-Smith really went to town on it at the weekend. And it seems strange to me because there's a positive correlation between age and the use of postal votes in the country. And given that the Tories are utterly dependent on particularly elderly votes, it seems odd to attack a form of voting associated with the elderly. Yes, the likes of Brendan Clark-Smith are probably thinking about, people with disabilities, they vote Labour, yeah, we'll knacker them. But let's be honest, if the Tories did decide to restrict postal voting, there's probably no time now before the election, but let's say they did, there's no way they'd be able to prevent people with disabilities using it, because that will be an obvious exception. Oh, yeah, it should be for people who will struggle to use a polling station. So, yeah, so they'd end up sort of still letting the groups of people more associated with anti-Tory voting have postal voting, and they'd just take it away from their own voters. It would inevitably hit elderly but otherwise fit and healthy voters. Why would the Tories want to do that? I suppose the fact that these calls to look at postal voting aren't widespread within the Conservative Party probably suggests they realise this one does them no favours. In fact, you know, the government's official position is that postal voting is good. So you could just think at this point it's just Brendan Clark-Smith and a couple of others being an idiot again. The government have not suggested that they're in favour of a move to restrict postal voting. They understand, actually, no, a lot of our voters use it. An article in Byline Times talks about the way in which postal voting actually seems to help the Tories. It noted that without postal votes, Boris Johnson would not have beaten Ken Livingstone for the London mayoral race over 10 years ago. You know, that could have changed all sorts of the course of British history since. It also cited a study which found left-wing voters were actually less likely to use postal votes. So at this point, you are thinking Brendan Clark-Smith is an idiot. He's one of the Tory MPs scheduled for destruction at the general election. He was looking at these local election results, really close to home, panicking and desperate for any advantage. But he is also a fool, so he doesn't realise that this particular thing would not give him an advantage, would actually work against him. Then someone on Twitter, John West, made an interesting point. The research indicates that UKIP did very well out of postal voting in 2019. Could it be that the smaller parties use postal voting to their advantage, in which case maybe the thinking is that although restricting it might not create a net suppressive effect to the Labour vote, maybe it would for the Reform UK votes. I'm not sure about this. First of all, in 2019, UKIP were not a small party, a tiny party. They'd collapsed by then. Completely disappeared from their 2015 heyday. They were not simply a small party, but a minuscule party. Effectively too small a sample to be able to say anything. And the results for the Brexit Party, which is a much closer parallel to Reform UK, showed more benefit from postal voting than the Conservatives or Labour, but I'm not sure enough to get excited about. Another thought I had was that many of the right-wing commentators who've been bellyaching about postal voting for a while are much more closely aligned with Reform UK than the Conservative Party. Why would they be opposing postal voting if it would suppress the impact of their preferred party? It strikes me that their complaints about postal voting have less to do with wanting to genuinely cajole the government into changing it and more to do with creating a general mistrust of our electoral system. Potentially not dissimilar to the Trumpian line after the last presidential election. Convince people that there was something untoward about the way the votes were counted, that the election wasn't done properly, in order to claim that the winners are not really the winners and therefore are not really the government. I can see Reform UK supporters going along with this line. The fact is that Reform UK continue to have an inflated vote share in most polls. When you look at their performance in actual elections, they fall flat, even in these local elections. They did all right in the Blackpool by-election, but that was like one election. You can imagine them targeting that. But when they had to contest, and they weren't contesting anywhere near the full number of seats in the local elections, it was like 323. And yet they only won 2, and in 2 where they weren't really being opposed. You know, the 2 councillors they won last week were both new seats, so there was no real challenge for them. No one was really putting anyone against them. But winning just 2 seats out of the 323 they contested, for a party polling at about 15% in the Nationals, that is a very poor result. So Reform UK are very bad at turning voting intention into actual votes. And I think it's because their popularity is entirely based on the mainstream media platforming them far too much. But because they have no real infrastructure, their campaign on the ground is almost non-existent. You know, they can do all right in a by-election, as I say, because they can focus their resources. But when contesting a spread of seats, as they did in the locals, and they will have to in the general election, they fall flat because they can't focus just one seat then. They have to spread their resources, and the resources are very few. I think they're not going to do very well at all in the general election. I think they're going to do significantly worse than their polling would suggest. I think that is the main polling error that we've got at the moment. I think they'll still cost the Tories a lot of seats, potentially still dozens of seats. But the chances are that they won't do anywhere near as well as many pollsters think they will. I absolutely think this is the biggest weakness in polling right now. It's hard to model Reform UK because their appeal is entirely top down. The usual rules don't apply. There's no grassroots, there's no party infrastructure, there's no network of councillors coordinating things. So their national vote share is incredibly soft. And when the general election results are known, and Reform UK seem to have done much worse than expected, I can see accusations of the woke establishment having somehow done something dodgy to suppress the Reform UK results. And that probably Brendan Clark-Smith just got caught up in it all, thinking that because he's seen right-wing shills arguing against it, that postal voting must somehow be something that favours the left wing, when the truth is, no, it doesn't. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.